The police were hunting a serial killer across Florida. Every profile said the same thing. You're looking for a man. They were wrong. For an entire year, 7 bodies along the highways, and every investigative instinct, every FBI framework, every decade of behavioral science pointed away from the truth, because the person pulling the trigger of that .22 caliber pistol did not exist in any manual. Middle-aged men, armed men, a former police chief, a reserve police officer, each of them stopped their car, opened the door, and let the killer in voluntarily. How does a predator hide in plain sight on a public highway? The answer dismantled everything criminology believed in 1990. This is the complete case of the killer nobody suspected, because the killer was a woman. December 13th, 1989, Volusia County, Florida. 2 men scavenging for scrap metal along a dirt road off Interstate 95 find something wrapped in a rubber carpet runner beneath the palmettos. At first, they think it's discarded trash. It is a human body, decomposed, nearly 2 weeks exposed to the Florida heat. The medical examiner counts the entry wounds. Multiple gunshots from a small-caliber weapon, .22, fired into the torso. The bullets did not kill quickly. The lungs filled slowly. The examiner estimates the man may have taken more than 10 minutes to die. The victim is identified as Richard Mallory, 51 years old, the owner of an electronics repair shop in Clearwater. His Cadillac had already been found on November 30th, abandoned near Ormond Beach. Keys gone, wallet gone, several personal items missing. Investigators note the details and file them into a familiar framework. A robbery, a business dispute. Mallory was a man with a chaotic personal life, a drinker, a man who paid for sex regularly. The list of people who might want him dead was long, and every name on that list belonged to a man. That assumption was not lazy police work. It was the entire weight of criminal science. By 1989, the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit had spent 15 years building the architecture of serial murder profiling, and the data was overwhelming. Serial killers who target strangers, who use firearms, who dump bodies along highways, statistically male, almost without exception. Women who killed differently. They killed husbands, patients, children in their care. They used poison, suffocation, medical means. They killed people they knew in private spaces. The idea of a woman as a highway predator, selecting strangers, shooting them multiple times, robbing the bodies, dumping them in the woods, and doing it again and again, did not fit any documented pattern in American criminal history. So when the second body appeared, the investigation looked for a man. When the third appeared, a man. The fourth, the fifth, the sixth. Different counties, different jurisdictions, detectives who did not talk to each other, all searching separately for a phantom male killer, while the actual killer stood on the shoulder of the highway with her thumb out, and the next victim slowed down and stopped and offered her a ride. Her name was Aileen Wuornos. Within 2 years, she would be on Florida's death row, branded by the press as America's first female serial killer, a label that was technically false and yet captured something true. Nothing like her had ever moved through the system before. The prosecutors called her a cold predator who executed 7 men for their wallets. She called herself a victim who fired in self-defense against men who attacked her. The jury took 91 minutes to choose, and more than 3 decades later, with new documentaries still being produced about her case, with her own death row recordings still being released, the question refuses to close. Was Aileen Wuornos a monster, a victim, or the one thing the justice system has never known how to process, both at once? To answer that, the timeline cannot begin in Florida in 1989. It has to begin 23 years earlier in the cold of Michigan, with a 14-year-old girl who was already pregnant, already discarded, and already learning that the only thing men would ever give her had a price attached. Aileen Carol Pittman was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. A leap-year child, born on a date that only exists once every 4 years. The circumstances of her birth read like a case file before her life even began. Her mother, Aileen Wuornos, had married at 14. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was gone before Aileen was born, and Aileen would never meet him. That, in the coldest forensic terms, may have been the only mercy of her childhood. Leo Pittman was a diagnosed schizophrenic and a convicted child molester, a man who was eventually imprisoned for the rape of a 7-year-old girl. In 1969, in his cell, he hanged himself. Aileen was 13 years old. She learned that her biological father existed and that he was dead as almost the same piece of information. Diane, still a teenager, lasted less than 4 years as a mother. In 1960, she abandoned Aileen and her older brother Keith and left them with her own parents, Mallory and Britta Wuornos, in Troy, Michigan. The grandparents legally adopted the children, and for years Aileen and Keith believed Mallory and Britta were their real parents. The discovery of the truth around age 11 landed on a child already fracturing. The two people raising her were not her parents. Her real mother had thrown her away. Her real father was a predator who died in a prison cell. The household itself offered no refuge. Mallory Wuornos was an alcoholic with a violent temper. Aileen would later describe beatings with a leather belt, administered on bare skin, sometimes with her face held down. She described being told she was worthless, that she should never have been born, that she was evil like her father. Britta, also an alcoholic, faded into the background of the home rather than shielding the children. Aileen would later allege sexual abuse inside that house as well, allegations that were never adjudicated in any court, but which she repeated consistently to psychologists, journalists, and the people closest to her until the day she died. What is documented beyond dispute is what the neighborhood children remembered decades later when investigators and filmmakers came asking. By age 11, Aileen was trading sexual acts with local boys for cigarettes, spare change, and food. The boys had a name for her, a cruel one, and the encounters happened in the woods near her house, in cars, in a fort the kids had built. The adults of the neighborhood knew the rumors. No one intervened. Before she was old enough for high school, Aileen Wuornos had already internalized the transaction that would define her entire adult existence. Her body was the only currency she possessed, and the men around her were customers, never protectors. Then, at 14, she became pregnant. Aileen said the pregnancy was the result of rape. She gave different accounts over the years of who the man was, describing him as an acquaintance of her grandfather. Whatever the truth of the man's identity, the family's response is a matter of record. There was no investigation, no protection, no comfort. Aileen was sent away to a home for unwed mothers, where staff described her as hostile and uncooperative. The clinical vocabulary of institutions describing a traumatized child with nowhere to put her rage. On March 23, 1971, she gave birth to a boy. The baby was taken from her and placed for adoption immediately. She was not yet 15. She would never see him again. 4 months later, Britta Wuornos died, liver failure, the long invoice of her alcoholism, and with Britta gone, whatever thin thread held the household together snapped. Laurie wanted the girl out. At 15 years old, Aileen Wuornos was expelled from the only home she had, and her response tells you everything about what that home had been worth. She moved into the woods. Literally. Through the Michigan cold, she slept in an abandoned car in the forest near her old neighborhood, wrapped in stolen blankets, surviving on what she could beg, steal, or earn the only way she had ever earned anything. Selling herself now to grown men, at 15 at highway rest stops and in parked cars. Stop on that image for a moment because the entire case pivots on it. Every serial killer file contains a childhood, and investigators are trained to resist the pull of sympathy. Plenty of people survive brutal childhoods and harm no one. That is true, and it matters. But the forensic question is not whether the childhood excuses what came later. The question is whether the pattern that ended on Florida's highways in 1989 was already fully assembled in the Michigan woods in 1971. A girl for whom every adult had been a threat or an absence, for whom sex and survival had been fused into a single act since age 11, for whom the interior of a stranger's car was simultaneously a workplace, a shelter, and the most dangerous room on earth. The woman the police could not imagine in 1990 was built, piece by documented piece, 20 years earlier, while an entire town watched and did nothing. Her brother Keith, the one person who shared her history, was drafted into her losses too. In July 1976, Keith Wuornos died of throat cancer. He was 21. Aileen received roughly $10,000 from his life insurance, the largest sum of money she would ever legally possess. It was gone within 2 months, a car she quickly wrecked, spending sprees, nothing left. The pattern repeated with everything she touched. Money, relationships, opportunities, they burned through her hands because nothing in her development had ever taught her that anything good could last. By then, she had already drifted south. In 1974, at 18, she was arrested in Jefferson County, Colorado, drunk driving, disorderly conduct, and firing a .22 caliber pistol from a moving vehicle. Note the weapon. A .22. 15 years before Richard Mallory's body was found wrapped in a carpet runner, the caliber was already in her file. She skipped the court date and kept moving, hitchhiking the interstate system, working truck stops and highway exits, and eventually following the corridor of warmth and transient men down to Florida, the state where every American runaway story either restarts or ends. And in Florida, in 1976, came the strangest chapter of her early life, the one that sounds invented and is fully documented. Aileen, 20 years old, hitchhiking, was picked up by a man named Louis Gratz Fell, 69 years old, the president of a yacht club, a wealthy retiree from Philadelphia society. Within weeks, they were married. The wedding announcement ran in the local newspaper, the society pages no less. For one surreal moment, the girl from the Michigan woods had legally entered American respectability. It lasted 9 weeks. Aileen did not become a yacht club wife. She continued going to bars, continued getting into fights, and was arrested in a pool hall brawl. When Fell tried to control her spending, the confrontations escalated until, by his account, she beat him with his own cane. He obtained a restraining order and an annulment. She took back the name Wuornos and returned to the highways. The lesson she extracted, by her own later telling, was not that she had destroyed an opportunity. It was that even marriage was a transaction, and she had been acquired like a decoration and discarded when she failed to behave like one. The following decade, 1976 to 1986, is a slow-motion collapse recorded almost entirely in police paperwork. Armed robbery of a convenience store in Edgewater, Florida in 1981. She walked in with a .22, took $35 and 2 packs of cigarettes, and was arrested within minutes, still wearing the same clothes. She served over a year in prison. After release, forged checks, grand theft auto, resisting arrest, a stolen pistol found under the seat of a car she was driving. Aliases began to multiply: Sandra Kretsch, Laurie Grody, Susan Blahovec, and later the one that would eventually undo her, Cammie Marsh Green. Each alias was a borrowed or stolen identity, a new skin for a woman whose own name carried nothing but warrants. There were suicide attempts, at least 6 by her own count, starting in her teens, including shooting herself in the stomach in 1978. Read that again. Before she ever shot another human being, Aileen Wuornos had already shot herself. Psychologists who examined her years later would diagnose borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, a combination marked by explosive rage, catastrophic abandonment fear, impulsivity, and a perception of the world as permanently, unchangeably hostile. Whatever label applies, the trajectory was visibly terminal. By her late 20s, she was hitchhiking the Florida highways full-time, soliciting clients at truck stops, sleeping in motels when there was money, and in the woods when there wasn't, drinking heavily, carrying everything she owned in a single bag. And then, in 1986, in a gay bar in Daytona Beach called Zodiac, she met a shy, red-haired, 24-year-old motel maid named Tyria Moore. And for the first time in 30 years of documented existence, Aileen Wuornos attached herself to another human being completely. Understand what Moore represented, because without it, nothing that follows makes sense. Every relationship in Aileen's life had been extraction, someone taking from her, or her taking from someone. Tyria Moore was, in Aileen's perception, the first person who simply stayed. They moved between cheap motels and rented rooms together for 4 years. Aileen called her my wife. She supported them both the only way she knew how, working the highways, and as the years ground on, as Aileen aged, as the money got thinner, as the clients got rougher and the nights in the woods more frequent, one conviction hardened inside her, the conviction that psychologists would later identify as the emotional engine of everything that came after. She could not lose Tyria. Whatever it took, whatever it cost, whoever it cost. By November 1989, the pieces were all in position. A woman with a lifetime of male violence stored in her body, a .22 caliber pistol in her bag, a love she was terrified of losing and could barely afford to keep, and a highway full of men who would stop for her, because a woman alone on the shoulder of the road looks, to a certain kind of man, like an opportunity. One of those men was Richard Mallory, and what happened between the two of them, in the dark, off a dirt road in Volusia County, would become the most contested 12 hours in the history of American female crime, because Richard Mallory had a secret of his own, one the jury that sentenced Aileen Wuornos to death was never allowed to hear. Begin with the secret, because the entire moral architecture of this case rests on it. Richard Mallory, the first victim, was presented to the jury in 1992 as an ordinary businessman, a 51-year-old electronics shop owner who made the fatal mistake of offering a ride to the wrong hitchhiker. The prosecution built its case on that image, a harmless customer, executed for his money. Aileen's defense claimed the opposite, that Mallory had attacked her, beaten her and attempted to rape her, and that she fired to survive. The jury heard her version from her own mouth, uncorroborated, delivered by a hostile and erratic defendant against the clean testimony of investigators. They did not believe her. What the jury never heard was this: Richard Mallory had served 10 years in prison for a sexual attack on a woman. The conviction was in Maryland, decades earlier, attempted rape. He had been committed for treatment as a sexual offender. The records existed. The information sat in government files throughout the entire trial, undiscovered by the defense, unmentioned by the prosecution. It surfaced only years after the death sentence, when Michelle Gillen, an investigative journalist with Dateline NBC, pulled Mallory's records and put them on national television. Understand precisely what that fact does and does not prove. It does not prove that Mallory attacked Aileen Wuornos on the night of November 30th, 1989. Men with violent histories can still be murdered in cold blood, but the American legal standard is not certainty. It is reasonable doubt. And the question that has haunted this case for 3 decades is brutally simple. If 12 jurors had known that the man Aileen claimed tried to rape her was a convicted sexual offender who had spent a decade locked up for attacking a woman, would 91 minutes of deliberation have been enough to send her to the electric chair? We will return to that courtroom. First, the crimes themselves, all of them in order exactly as the evidence recorded them. November 30th, 1989. Mallory closes his shop in Clearwater and drives toward Daytona, a trip he made regularly. A divorced man, a heavy drinker, a regular consumer of paid sex, road-tripping with cash in his wallet. Somewhere along the way, he picks up Aileen Wuornos. By her account, they drive, drink, talk for hours, and eventually pull off a dirt road outside Daytona to complete the transaction. What happened next exists only in her tellings, and she told it multiple ways over the years, which the prosecution would later weaponize. In the version she maintained at trial, Mallory turned violent, beat her, sodomized her, and threatened to kill her, and she got to her gun and fired. In the version she screamed in her final interviews, and in an unguarded hot mic moment before her execution, it was self-defense after all, and she had only ever said otherwise to speed up her own death sentence. The physical record: Mallory's body, wrapped in a carpet runner, multiple .22 rounds in the torso, dead slowly. His Cadillac abandoned, his property pawned. Pay attention to the pawn shop. Pawn shops require identification and a thumbprint in Florida. It will matter. Whatever happened on that dirt road, one fact is beyond argument. Aileen was not caught. Mallory's murder went into the Volusia County files as an unsolved robbery homicide with a long list of male suspects, and Aileen went back to the highway. For 6 months, nothing. The gap matters forensically, because when the killing resumed, it did not resume as a single ambiguous incident. It resumed as a pattern. June 1st, 1990, Citrus County. The body of David Spears, a 43-year-old heavy equipment operator from Sarasota, is found nude along State Road 19, 6 .22 caliber bullets. Spears was, by every account, a gentle and generous man, a hard worker driving to Orlando who had a habit of picking up hitchhikers. His pickup truck was found abandoned on Interstate 75, a used condom nearby. Whatever story each individual death might tell, the physical signature was now repeating. Middle-aged man traveling alone, .22 caliber, body off the road, vehicle abandoned at a distance, valuables gone. 5 days later, June 6th, Pasco County, 30 miles away. A body so decomposed in the summer heat that identification takes weeks. Charles Carskadden, 40 years old, a part-time rodeo worker driving south to meet his fiancée. 9 rounds, 9, from a small caliber weapon. His car surfaces separately. His gun, his money, his belongings are gone. 3 dead men in 3 counties, and here the structural failure of the investigation becomes visible. 3 different sheriff's offices, 3 separate case files, no statewide mechanism forcing them to talk. The pattern that seems obvious from above was invisible from inside, because each detective was looking at one dead man, and every framework said dead men on highways are killed by other men. While Carskadden's body was still unidentified, the case that should have broken everything open was already in motion. Peter Seames, 65 years old, a retired merchant seaman turned Christian missionary, left his home in Jupiter, Florida on June 7th, heading toward Arkansas with a car full of Bibles. He never arrived. Seames is the ghost of this case. His body has never been found. To this day, what was found on July 4th, 1990, was his silver Pontiac Sunbird, crashed and abandoned near Orange Springs. And this time there were witnesses. 2 women had been seen climbing out of the wrecked Sunbird, one blonde, one a stocky brunette, throwing beer cans into the woods, cursing and hurrying away on foot, refusing help from a passerby. The blonde had left something on the driver's door, a bloody palm print. Rhonda Bailey, watching from her porch, saw them. Descriptions were taken, and for the first time in 8 months, the phantom male killer acquired a different shape. 2 shapes, in fact. Police sketches of the 2 women went out. Almost no one connected them to the dead men yet. But the clock had started. Note what the crash reveals about the killer's state, because it marks the escalation phase that ends every serial career. Aileen was no longer separating the killing from her life. She and Tyria Moore were driving a murdered man's car together, drunk in daylight on a public road. Moore would later swear she asked few questions about where the cars and cash kept coming from. The jury of public opinion has never fully believed her. The legal system never charged her. Hold that thought. Her account is the spine of the trial to come. The killing accelerated through the summer like a fever chart. July 30th, 1990. Troy Burress, a 50-year-old sausage delivery driver from Ocala, a friendly, well-liked man on his regular route, fails to complete his deliveries. His truck is found abandoned. 5 days later, a family picnicking in the Ocala National Forest finds his body 8 miles away. 2.22 rounds. His wedding ring and cash are gone. The company clipboard is missing. Burress had no vices to blame, no secret life for detectives to chase. The comfortable explanations were running out. September 12, 1990. The case crosses a line that, in retrospect, reads like the beginning of the end. Charles Dick Humphreys, 56 years old, a retired Air Force major, a former police chief, a serving investigator for the Florida Department of Health and Rehabilitative Services, specializing, the detail is almost unbearable, in protecting abused children. Humphreys was found in Marion County, fully clothed, shot 7 times with a .22. His car turned up a county away. His badge and personal effects were gone. His wallet was later found discarded along a highway. A man who had spent his career reading Dangerous People, armed with decades of law enforcement instinct, had stopped his car for the killer and let her in. If Humphreys did not see it coming, the profile was not just wrong. It was a blindfold. November 19th, 1990. The last body. Walter Gino Antonio, 62, a trucker and reserve police officer, found on a logging road in Dixie County, nearly nude, 4.22 rounds in his back and head. His police reserve badge, his handcuffs, his nightstick, trophies of authority, gone. His car abandoned days later in Brevard County. 7 men in 12 months. Mallory, Spears, Carskadden, Seams, Burris, Humphreys, Antonio. Ages 40 to 65. All traveling alone on Florida highways. All shot with the same caliber. All robbed. And now lay the victims' secret lives on the table because the case demands honesty in both directions. Some of these men, the evidence suggests, stopped for a sex worker. Others, Burris, Humphreys, by every indication seems, appear to have simply offered a stranger a ride. The self-defense narrative that is at least arguable in a paid sexual encounter turned violent becomes progressively harder to sustain across 7 bodies, including a missionary and a child protection investigator shot 7 times. That is the wall Aileen's defenders have always hit, and yet the prosecution's clean counter-narrative, pure robbery, 7 executions for pocket money, has its own wall. Aileen earned money constantly and killed rarely. Thousands of transactions across those years ended with no one hurt. 7 did not. What separated those 7 encounters from all the others is a question only one living person could ever answer. And the answers she gave kept changing. By late November 1990, the investigation finally did what it should have done months earlier. Marion County Captain Steve Binigar, staring at the map of bodies, pushed the connected case theory and made a decision that broke the dam. He went public. The sketches of the 2 women from the Seams crash were released to the press statewide. Newspapers across Florida ran them at the end of November under headlines about dead men on the highways. The calls started immediately, and 4 separate tips gave police the same 2 names. The stocky brunette looked like a motel maid named Tyria Moore, and the blonde was her rough-edged girlfriend, a woman known at truck stops and biker bars along the 75 corridor. Some callers knew her as Lee. Some knew her as Susan Blahovec, or Laurie Grody, or Cammie Marsh Green. Detectives began pulling records on every alias, and in a Daytona area pawn shop under the name Cammie Marsh Green, they found a ticket for a camera and a radar detector, property of Richard Mallory. Florida pawn law had done its quiet work. Next to the signature was a thumbprint. The print went to the state lab. It matched the bloody palm print from Peter Seams's wrecked Sunbird. And it matched a name sitting in the system with an outstanding weapons warrant from 1974, a .22 fired from a moving car 16 years earlier. The Phantom finally had a name, Aileen Carol Wuornos. She had by then nothing left. Tyria Moore had taken the warning signs and fled to her family in Ohio. The motel rooms were gone. In the first week of January 1991, the most wanted woman in Florida was sleeping on a stripped car seat on the porch of a biker bar called The Last Resort outside Port Orange, broke, drinking on credit, carrying everything she owned. Undercover officers found her there on January 8th. They spent a day watching her, then moved in without mentioning murder. She was arrested quietly on the old weapons warrant, so casually that she reportedly thought it was a mistake that would clear by morning. She did not know 3 things: The .22 pistol was already gone. She and Moore had thrown it into Rose Bay, and police divers would soon be pulling it out of the black water. Tyria Moore had already been found in Ohio and was already talking. And the next voice she would hear on a telephone, the only voice she had ever fully trusted, was being recorded by the police, reading from a script designed for a single purpose: to make Aileen Wuornos confess. January 1991. Volusia County Branch Jail. Aileen Wuornos sits in custody, believing she is being held on a 16-year-old weapons charge. She has given the name Laurie Grody. She has admitted nothing, and the investigators holding her have a problem that modern audiences, raised on DNA cases, tend to forget. Their physical evidence was thin. A thumbprint on a pawn ticket proved she pawned a dead man's camera, receiving stolen property. A palm print proved she had touched a missing man's car. Neither print put a gun in her hand. Without more, the biggest case in Florida had a real chance of shrinking into a property crimes file. What they needed was her voice, and they knew exactly which key would open it. Detectives had located Tyria Moore within days, staying with her sister in Pennsylvania after fleeing through Ohio. Picture Moore's position with forensic coldness. She had lived for years off money that arrived after men died. She had ridden in at least one victim's car and helped abandon it. She had, by her own admission, heard Aileen come home and say she had killed a man and had chosen to ask nothing. Whether that made her an accessory was a live legal question, and the investigators let it hang over her precisely as long as it was useful. Moore was never charged with anything. In exchange, she gave them everything. She confirmed the aliases, the timeline, the pawned property, and then she agreed to the operation that broke the case. She traveled to a Daytona motel and, under police direction, began accepting collect calls from the jail. Over 3 days in mid-January, the recorded line did its work. The script was psychological warfare calibrated to the one vulnerability Aileen had left. Moore told her the police were after her, Tyria, for the murders, that her family was suffering, that she might go to prison for crimes she didn't commit. On the tapes, preserved and later played to the jury, you can hear Aileen's resistance collapse in real time, call by call. She's cautious at first. She knows jail lines are recorded. She says so out loud. Then Moore cries, and Aileen's caution burns away against the only loyalty she has ever held. "I'm not going to let you go to jail," she tells her. "I love you. If I have to confess everything to keep you out of trouble, I will." 3 decades later, with the tapes public, the exchange reads almost unbearably. A woman confessing to capital murder as an act of love, coaxed by the beloved, produced and directed by the police. It was also, under American law, entirely legal. There is no privilege between girlfriends, no right to be free of a trusted voice reading a script. Whatever else the case proves, it documents this. The same attachment that may have driven Aileen to kill, the terror of losing Tyria, is the instrument the state used to catch her. The lock and the key were the same shape. On January 16, 1991, Aileen Wuornos asked to speak with investigators. In a recorded session lasting roughly 3 hours, with a public defender present whose advice she serially ignored, she confessed to shooting Richard Mallory, David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Peter Seams, Troy Burress, Charles Humphreys, and Walter Antonio. Watch the tape. Portions have been public for years, and the forensic details accumulate exactly where they should. She knew calibers, body positions, dump sites, what was taken. She told them where the gun went into Rose Bay. Divers pulled the .22 from the water. The confession was, as evidence, devastating and self-authenticating. But inside those 3 hours, a second battle was already being fought, the one that would define the next decade. Because Aileen did not confess to 7 executions. She confessed to 7 acts of self-defense. Again and again on the tape, in her fractured, looping, furious syntax, she returns to the same structure. The man turned violent. The man tried to rape her. The man was going to kill her. She got to her gun first. The detectives, correctly identifying the legal stakes, press her every single one. Lee, all 7 attacked you. And her answers wander, contradict, double back. In a single session, she raises and abandons versions, inflates and deflates details. Prosecutors would later count what they claimed were dozens of internal inconsistencies. Her supporters would answer, "This is what a lifetime of trauma, alcohol-scarred memory, and borderline cognition sounds like under interrogation without competent counsel." The confession of a woman who had, at that point, the approximate legal sophistication of a child, and who seemed principally concerned, on the tape, with making sure everyone knew Tyria had nothing to do with any of it. Both readings fit the same tape. That is the case in miniature. What happened next had no precedent in American criminal history because the machine that switched on in January 1991 was not just judicial. Within days of her arrest, before any trial, before any conviction, the commercial apparatus of true crime descended on the case with a speed that itself became a scandal. A female serial killer was a product no one had ever sold before. Movie producers were on the phone to Florida within weeks, and here the record turns genuinely rotten. 3 of the investigators on the case were soon negotiating, through an attorney, a media deal connected to a planned film, while the investigation was still open. When it surfaced, the scandal triggered an internal inquiry and permanently stained the case. Aileen's eventual appellate lawyers would argue the point without needing to embellish it. Some of the men responsible for building the case against her had a financial interest in the story of her guilt being as big, as clean, and as monstrous as possible. Everyone was selling. Tyria Moore cooperated with the same movie project. Reporters bid for jailhouse interviews. Within 2 years, made-for-TV movies were in production. The nickname machine ran day and night, the damsel of death, the highway hooker, and the label that stuck hardest and was flatly false. America's first female serial killer. She was nothing of the kind. The history of American crime holds dozens of female multiple murderers before her, from Belle Gunness to Nanny Doss. What was genuinely new was the category she broke. A woman killing male strangers with a gun in public space, serially. The press could not file her under any existing story, so it invented one, and the invention needed her to be a monster, because monsters sell. Into that circus, in late January 1991, walked the strangest figure in the entire case, Aileen Wuornos, a 44-year-old born-again Christian horse breeder from Ocala. Wuornos had seen Aileen's photograph in the newspaper and, by her own account, received an instruction from Jesus to write to her. Their correspondence became daily phone calls. The phone calls became a public crusade. Wuornos went on talk shows describing Aileen as a wounded, gentle soul failed by everyone she had ever met. And then, in November 1991, she and her husband did something without known precedent in a capital case. They legally adopted Aileen Wuornos, a 35-year-old accused serial killer, as their daughter. In Florida, adult adoption was lawful, and Prale told reporters it was God's plan and the only way she could be granted proper access to protect her. Read Prale generously, and she's the first person since Tyria, perhaps the first person ever, to offer Aileen unconditional attachment. People who watched them together described something that looked authentically like family. Read her coldly, and she was one more actor in the sales convention, giving interviews about her famous daughter to the same cameras as everyone else, and steering Aileen toward legal decisions, no contest pleas, putting her fate in God's hands, that ran directly against her chances of staying alive. The truth likely holds both readings at once. It usually does in this case. While the circus roared, the state of Florida made its strategic choices, and they were ruthless in their intelligence. 7 victims, 5 counties, but the state would not try a sprawling, connected serial case. It would begin with one victim in one courtroom, Richard Mallory in Volusia County. The choice was surgical. Mallory was the first kill, the one with the pawned property tied to Aileen's thumbprint, the one she had discussed in the most detail on tape. And the presiding realities were brutal for the defense. Florida's Williams Rule, a doctrine allowing evidence of similar crimes to prove pattern, meant prosecutors could parade the other 6 deaths through the Mallory trial to demolish self-defense. How can it be self-defense 7 times? While Aileen would be formally tried and could be sentenced to death for just the one, her defense team, public defenders led by Tricia Jenkins, understood the arithmetic and pushed hard for a plea. Take life sentences, avoid the chair. The state's position hardened around the electric chair. And Aileen, volatile, convinced the truth of Mallory's attack would be obvious to any jury, unaware that Mallory's decade-old conviction for a sexual attack was sitting undiscovered in Maryland files, wanted to testify. Jury selection began in DeLand, Florida, in January 1992, 1 year, almost to the day after her arrest. The state announced it would seek death. The cameras filled the courtroom, and the central question walked in with her. The question this channel exists to ask, not whether she did it, she said she did, but whether anyone in that room, on either table, in the jury box or behind the bench, was capable of seeing the defendant as she actually was, because the machine had already decided what she was. The trial's function, her defenders would argue for the next decade, was to ratify it. State of Florida versus Aileen Wuornos opened in January 1992 in a DeLand courtroom presided over by Judge Uriel Blount, and from its first hours the trial displayed the shape it would keep to the end. Every structural advantage ran in one direction. The prosecution, led by Assistant State Attorney John Tanner's office, built its case like masonry. The pawn ticket with her thumbprint, tying her hands to Richard Mallory's stolen property. The .22 caliber revolver recovered by divers from Rose Bay, consistent with the bullets recovered from the bodies. The 3-hour videotaped confession played for the jury, Aileen on screen, describing the shooting in her own voice. And then the weapon the defense had fought hardest to exclude. Under Florida's Williams Rule, the judge allowed the state to present evidence of the other killings. Jurors impaneled to decide one death heard the outline of 7. The legal purpose was to prove pattern and rebut self-defense. The practical effect was that Aileen Wuornos was tried for the Mallory murder in name, and for being a serial killer in fact. Then the state called its emotional centerpiece, Tyria Moore, consider the staging. The woman Aileen called her wife, the person she had confessed on tape to protecting at the cost of her own life, walked into the courtroom as a witness for the prosecution, immunized by cooperation, and testified against her. Moore told the jury that on the night after Mallory disappeared, Aileen came home and said calmly that she had killed a man that day, that she showed no injuries, that she did not seem frightened or bruised or in shock, just matter of fact. Under Florida law, that testimony went to the heart of self-defense. A woman who had barely survived a rape attempt, the state argued, does not come home composed and say it like a chore completed. On cross-examination, the defense could do little with her. Moore admitted she had asked no questions across months of unexplained cars and cash, and the jury was left to weigh her convenient blindness. But her account of that night stood, unshaken, and the recorded jailhouse calls corroborated the relationship's architecture. Aileen protects Tyria, always. Even now, on the stand, being buried by her, Aileen mouthed toward Moore that she loved her. The reporters in the gallery wrote it down. The defense's position was close to hopeless before it began, and then Aileen made it worse in the only way still available. She insisted on testifying. Her lawyers begged her not to. She overrode them. She believed, with the certainty of someone who had actually been in that car, that if she simply told the jury what Mallory did, they would understand. Her testimony on January 25, 1992, was the collapse of the case, and it is painful to reconstruct even at 30 years' distance. Direct examination went adequately. She described the night, the drinking, and then a Mallory who turned violent, who tied her, beat her, raped and tortured her and threatened to kill her until she reached her gun and fired. But she was a catastrophic witness for her own truth, combative, digressive, erupting at the prosecutor. And on cross-examination, the state's attorney did precisely what the law allowed, confronted her with the differences between this account and her January 1991 taped confession, line by line. Cornered on the advice her counsel could only repeat helplessly, she invoked the Fifth Amendment, and did so, by the count reported at the time, 25 times in front of the jury. A defendant claiming pure self-defense, declining to answer questions about the event 25 times. Whatever presumption of innocence survived, the Williams Rule evidence did not survive that. The prosecution's closing wrapped the arithmetic in a phrase. She was, Tanner told the jury, a predator who killed for money and killed because she liked it. And the other 6 bodies stood behind him as he said it. The defense's closing asked the jury to see a lifetime of male violence culminating in one dark car. On January 27, 1992, the jury retired. 91 minutes later, they returned, guilty of first-degree murder. Aileen exploded before the cameras as the verdict was read, shouting that she was innocent, that she had been raped, and, turning toward the jury, she delivered the line that led every newscast in America that night. "I'm innocent, I was raped. I hope you get raped, scumbags of America." If any doubt remained about the penalty phase, that outburst extinguished it. Days later, the same jury heard the state present her as remorseless and dangerous. Heard defense experts describe borderline personality disorder and a childhood of documented horror, and voted 12-0 to recommend death. On January 31, 1992, Judge Blount sentenced Aileen Wuornos to die in the electric chair. And here the case's legal history takes the turn that separates it from nearly every other serial case. There was never a second trial. What Aileen watched happen in that Dayland courtroom broke something in her strategy for staying alive. Under the counsel, spiritual more than legal, of Arlene Prowler, and a new attorney, Stephen Glazer, she stopped fighting. In March 1992, she pleaded no contest to the murders of Dick Humphreys, Troy Burris, and David Spears, telling the court she wanted to get right with God. The plea gave the state 3 more death sentences without calling a witness. In June 1992, she pleaded guilty to Charles Carskadden's murder, a 5th death sentence. In February 1993, she pleaded guilty to killing Walter Antonio, a 6th. For Peter Seams, the missionary whose body has never been found, no charge was ever brought. His name enters the record only through her confession, 6 death sentences, 1 trial, 91 minutes of deliberation, standing behind all of it. The appellate decade that followed, 1993 to 2002, is where the case stopped being about what Aileen did and became about what the system is. Her appeals raised the media deals of the investigators. They raised the Williams Rule avalanche. Above all, after Michelle Gillen's Dateline reporting surfaced Richard Mallory's Maryland record, the conviction for a sexual attack, the years committed as a sex offender, her lawyers raised the question that still has no comfortable answer. The single victim whose case went to trial, the case on which the credibility of her self-defense claim was publicly destroyed, was a man with a documented history of sexual violence against women. And the jury never knew. The Florida Supreme Court declined to disturb the conviction. The courts held, among other things, that the newly surfaced record did not meet the standard to require a new trial. As a matter of law, the question closed. As a matter of everything else, it never has. But by the time the courts finished, the person at the center had made the arguments irrelevant. Aileen's final transformation on death row was the strangest and most disputed chapter of her life. Beginning around 2001, she reversed course completely. She withdrew her appeals, fired the lawyers fighting for her, and told anyone who would listen that the self-defense claims were lies, that she had robbed and killed the men in cold blood, that she would kill again, and that the state should stop wasting money and execute her. She petitioned the Florida Supreme Court herself to dismiss her attorneys and hasten her death. Taken at face value, it was the confession that settled the case forever. Almost no one who was close to the situation took it at face value. Because in the same period, her recorded interviews, above all the final sessions with the British documentarian Nick Broomfield, who had followed the case for a decade, show a woman in visible psychological disintegration. Convinced her food was poisoned, that her mind was being controlled through the prison television, that sonic pressure was being run through her cell, that she would be taken away by angels on a spaceship. And then, the moment that hangs over everything, in a final interview, when Aileen believed the camera crew was no longer recording, her microphone still live, she dropped the monster performance entirely and said quietly that it had been self-defense after all, that she had been raped, and that she was saying otherwise because it was the only way to make them kill her faster. She had spent 11 years in a cage, and she wanted out, and death was the only door. Governor Jeb Bush ordered a psychiatric evaluation to determine whether she was competent to be executed. 3 experts interviewed her. All 3 certified her competent. The evaluation reportedly lasted the better part of an hour. October 9, 2002, Florida State Prison, Stark. Aileen Wuornos, 46 years old, declined a last meal, accepting only a cup of coffee. Her final statement, delivered flat and cryptic to the witnesses, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the rock And I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back. At 9:47 a.m., she was pronounced dead by lethal injection, the 10th woman executed in the United States since the death penalty's reinstatement, and the second by Florida. Arlene Praller did not attend. Tyria Moore never spoke to her again. Her ashes were carried home to Michigan by her childhood friend Dawn Botkins and scattered under a tree, back to the woods she had slept in at 15, the only place that had ever taken her in. The state of Florida closed its file on October 9th, 2002. The culture never did, and the reason it never did is the reason this case belongs on this channel. Aileen Wuornos is not remembered because of what she did. 7 highway homicides statistically would have faded. She's remembered because of what she broke. Start with the machinery of criminology itself, because the professional reckoning was real. For a full year, the assumption that highway predators are male functioned not as a hypothesis, but as a fact. And it cost lives. Run the timeline coldly. Richard Mallory died in November 1989. If the pattern had been recognized and pursued without the gender blindfold, if the investigation had seriously entertained, even as one branch of the tree, that the killer could be the blonde woman witnesses kept placing near the victims' vehicles. How many of the 6 men who died in 1990 die anyway? The question is unanswerable, and that is precisely the indictment. No one can answer it, because for most of that year, no one was asking it. David Spears, Charles Cascadden, Peter Seams, Troy Burris, Dick Humphreys, Walter Antonio. 6 families on the other side of an assumption. The case forced a revision that textbooks now treat as standard. Female serial offenders were not rarer than believed so much as differently shaped. And when one stepped outside the recognized shape, the system had no lens ground for her. The FBI's own behavioral literature absorbed Wuornos as the canonical outlier, a woman exhibiting what the frameworks classified as male pattern predation: strangers, firearms, public space, robbery. Some criminologists went further and argued the categories themselves were the problem. Build your science on the offenders you've caught, and you will keep catching only the offenders your science describes. Every profile is a lamp. Wuornos is what was standing in the dark, just outside its circle. Then the second thing she broke, the story America tells about victims and monsters, because she was inconveniently, simultaneously both, and every institution that touched her chose one half and amputated the other. The prosecution needed the monster, a remorseless predator executing men for pocket money, and her courtroom eruptions supplied the footage. Her defenders needed the pure victim, a raped child, a battered woman, the survivor of a lifetime of male violence finally striking back, and her childhood, fully documented, supplied that footage too. Watch every film, read every retrospective, and you watch the same tug-of-war over a human being who fit neither costume. The abused 11-year-old trading her body for cigarettes while a neighborhood watched was real. The woman who shot a child protection investigator 7 times and took his badge was real. The entire uncomfortable truth of this case is that both people lived in the same body, and the American justice system and the American entertainment industry proved equally incapable of holding them there together. And the entertainment industry arrived with a speed that remains its own scandal. Investigators discussing movie rights while bodies were still unidentified. Checkbooks waved at every witness. Within 11 years of her arrest, an actress won the Academy Award for playing her, Charlize Theron, in Monster, a transformation hailed as one of the great performances in film history. Sit with the grotesque symmetry of that. The Real Woman was executed in October 2002. The Oscar was handed out 16 months later. The industry that had circled her since the week of her arrest finally got its product, and the product was magnificent, and the woman was ash under a tree in Michigan. She had predicted it herself in her furious way years earlier, complaining from death row that everyone around her case was getting paid. The cops, the lawyers, the witnesses, the producers. On the arithmetic, she was simply correct. Everyone profited from the story of Aileen Wuornos, except every single person inside it. 7 men lost their lives. Their families got headlines that reduced fathers and brothers to the phrase "the victims," and she got the gurney at Stark. Even death did not end the extraction. The documentaries kept coming. Broomfield's 2 films, the streaming era's revisitations, and now, decades on, new productions still mining the case. Netflix's recent feature re-examining her life through her own death row recordings, and a forthcoming series that will reconstruct her using artificial intelligence. Think about that trajectory. She spent her last year telling cameras that her mind was being invaded and her words were being taken from her. The ravings, everyone agreed, of a disintegrating psyche. 24 years later, technology is being used to synthesize her face and voice to tell her story again. The machine she screamed about never stopped. It just upgraded. But strip away the industry, the profiling literature, the gender politics, and stand at the forensic center of the case one last time. Because this channel does not deal in comfortable endings, and this case does not offer one. Here is what the evidence supports, stated as plainly as 30 years of records allow. Aileen Wuornos killed 7 men. On that, her confessions, the physical evidence, and her own final statements agree. At least one of those men, the first, the only one whose case a jury ever heard, had a documented history of sexual violence that the jury deciding her life never learned. Some of the others, by everything in their files, were guilty of nothing but stopping the car. Her self-defense claim cannot be true of all 7 in the way she sometimes told it. Her prosecutor's portrait, the cold, simple robber, cannot survive the hot mic recording of a woman about to die, with nothing left to gain, whispering that it had been self-defense all along, and she just wanted the state to hurry. She lied when the truth would have helped her, and may have told the truth when only lies would have served her. She demanded her own execution while describing mind control and motherships, and 3 experts needed less than an hour to certify that mind as sound enough to kill. What does the case of Aileen Wuornos reveal about the human mind? 2 things, and they cut in opposite directions, which is why the case will never rest. About her mind, that a human being assembled from abandonment, violation, and transactional survival from the age of 11 without one intervening adult can arrive at a place where the line between defending her life and taking a life stops existing in any form the law can measure, and that everyone who could have redrawn that line for her from a Michigan neighborhood to a Florida courtroom declined. About our minds, that we are pattern-reading machines, and our patterns are made of the past, and anything genuinely new walks straight through us. 7 men died along the Florida highways in 12 months, and the deepest reason the killer was never suspected is the reason that gives this channel its name. Everyone was looking for a monster. Monsters, everyone knew, look a certain way. She was hitchhiking. She looked like someone who needed help. Somewhere on every highway tonight, someone slows down for a stranger and runs the same silent calculation those 7 men ran and trusts the same profile. That calculation has not improved. Only the case files have. If this case stayed with you, the archive holds others, including the ones the system failed even worse. Subscribe so you don't miss the next case. Some of them are still open.